Hey guys, I wanted to put together a tutorial that deals with one of the things I'm asking you to do for Studio, which is to create hybrid manual digital drawings to develop and execute a workflow. So based off of what you're learning in 243, to put together a way to compose a manual digital hybrid series of drawings, and that's for each of the required drawings. So the plans, the section, elevations, perspectives. So I wanted to just show you how I put together some recent pieces, and this is the one that I'm referring to here with this link. Again, I sent, so this is on the OneDrive, and here's the folder for that. So these are the pieces I was referring to there. And you can see this is the second of the two. There's a set. I just finished this one. This one's a little bit more refined, I would say, than this one. This is just I think, too big of a file size, so it's not giving me a preview. Anyway, you download it, I suppose, if you want to check it out. But this was done just with ink, kind of freehand drawing over a simple Rhino model. And I kind of mapped out some of the site conditions here that you can see, gave a little bit of reflection. But a lot of what you see here is hand drawing. These line extensions, the drawing overlays, just all hand drawn. And then in Photoshop, I started to bring in some mixed media. So some panoramic images that are about the site. This is a project in Milwaukee. And other relative issues. So these are articles from a periodical in Milwaukee, and I started to layer that into overall thinking. A very speculative project here. I went ahead, instead of freehanding, I went ahead and hardlined this. So same essential layers though. There is a underlayer from Rhino that includes, I think, a pen view of the model in this perspective. I just made some simple materials and rendered it, so there's a little bit of tonality from that. But the major, I think, depth here, and the Rhino model gave me shadows and everything, which is nice. And I rendered it with and without this screen scrim here, because I wanted to really impress and help to visualize it, the idea that this is a permeable, visually permeable skin. So then I went over and hardlined so the screen and some of the other details here, and overall the composition. So kind of setting this up, I'm just dragging out some of these perspective lines and some of these lines that came from typography. And then I just let it be about ideas. You know, this is a speculative project. This isn't anything that's necessarily going to be built necessarily. So it's really about ideas. It's about exploring. It's about communicating. It's about all those things that go into architectural design, and hopefully architectural design that leads us somewhere that we haven't been before, that I haven't been before in this case. That said, there's still some basic things I want you all to employ here. So demonstrate line drawing conventions, so line weights, different line types for hidden, overhead, hard edge, so really bold line versus smaller line, and elevations, poche, so dealing with poche. The example I'm showing you is a perspective, so it doesn't have all of those necessarily. But you should be thinking about and employing those conventions. And then, again, thinking about each drawing kind of as a photo montage. And they should fit on 11 by 17 sheets. Material textures, important regulating lines that are from the site. So this would be for plans, potentially other drawings as well. Descriptive text, so text can be part of it as well. So you have all the tools to put all these different components together from 243 and some of what we did in Studio. So I'm asking you to employ those, but also think about scale, so Entourage, think about context, expressions of the sky and the ground plane, and then really consider composition. You know, it's the drawings don't all have to always just sit in the middle of the sheet. It's sort of a similar mentality to when you have a project site. The project doesn't necessarily, and probably shouldn't always sit in the center, directly in the center of the site. So we have to think about things compositionally. Of course, in terms of design, we have to think about things contextually and how to respond to those issues, which are typically asymmetrical. So think about the composition of each sheet and how it's best, how to best express your ideas for space. Again, this is really pushing the overall ideas of space here, speculations for architecture, new architectures that are emerging here. Plan sections, elevations should directly reflect the photo montage, 3D relief construction, and elaborations for structure materiality. That, again, going back to these studies and allowing these to emerge as the architecture. This is the architecture. So the relief construction is essentially what you should be drawing with some elaboration of structure and materiality. So don't lose those dynamic spatial compositions, don't lose those intensities, don't lose that overall kind of frenzied nature of approaching it the way we did with these exercises. Let that be the architecture, let it be the expression, and keep pushing it forward, however abstract that may be. And that's something I'm really stressing here. So if all of a sudden your design takes a turn and becomes something, I don't know, recognizable as a building that you've seen before, or something else other than coming directly from these studies, that's something that will be downgraded. And so right now, this is the tutorial for that. Okay, so, and this is working towards putting together some drafts. So starting to output some of these drawings and putting them up on the wall, making sure that they're legible visually, making sure the contrast is there, and letting other people look at the drawings. Sometimes we'll look at these drawings far too long, and we tend to lose objective perspective of those drawings. So it's important to let others take a look and give you some feedback. So what I wanted to really talk about then are just the layers and how I approached these compositions, or this composition in particular, talking about the layers that came together for this. It may be slightly different for you, but just so you know what some of the building blocks for it were. I used a lot of layer blending, and so that's a tool here that is for each layer, has the possibility for it to be blended into those that are beneath that, and I'll show you a little bit about those. And I made heavy use of not only the alpha channel that we use for the drawing overlay, so I used that as well for the hand drawings, but layer masking. And so I'll show you a bit about how I use that. I'm just going to go in and show you the files for this. So again, here's the project. This is the second vignette of this series. So the first one that I uploaded is there. Here's the second one. And so I have raw files. And so I'll just click through some of these. I laid out an aerial photograph to scale in Rhino. And so in this point of view, I just went ahead and I believe this is just a printed PDF or PNG view of it. The background's not transparent here, with the intervention there. So I just did this because I wanted some of this texture to work with. Here it is, just the pen view without the, now this doesn't have the scrim, so I'm just looking at these masses kind of beyond, or within here, that would be on the underside of the scrim. So I wanted to make sure that that definition was there. Here I have some regulating lines that help me out with perspective in the ground that are there, and so here's one with and without. And you know, they're not perfect. You see it's a little bit different in terms of the value here, but that's fine. The layer blending will take care of that, and it's not meant to be exact anyway. Same view with the scrim on it. Again, this is that screen that's in front of the overall masses of space. This is intended to be a series of residential units here, and then a data center in the back to the north in Milwaukee, and solar panels would be integrated with this. Anyway, that's essentially what the massing is about. I don't know if I use this. You can kind of see the ghosting of the overall intervention there. So similar to this. This is with the scrim there, but it's just a print from the pen view, and with the image on the underside, it just does some weird things to some of the modeling. And here you can kind of see the ghosting or this kind of haze here of the scrim. So, I don't know if that was really useful. I was just, getting as much out of it, the simple Rhino model as I could. Again, this is fairly straightforward, simple masses. I didn't spend too much time on this massing. It was just to get a general idea for this as architectural speculation. Some different views here that we can see, and here's a rendered view of that, so we can see the screen. We can see, I just let this be all transparent, essentially, so you can get a sense of that, or I start to work with that, so I can see structure through it and so forth, kind of without part of the site base. And I didn't use all of these. I just gave myself a lot of options. I tend to also give myself some options just with the intervention on its own, so I can have that as a layer on its own over the site. So if I just wanted to do some intense things with the intervention itself, then I could do that. And here's their images about the site, so just panoramics around. This is actually the sky that I ended up using. I just found this on the internet. And that was about it for those. So those are the raw files coming from Rhino. These Photoshop layers, let's see here. So this is already an alpha channel, but this is just a scanned line drawing. So this is kind of what it looked like, and I just hardlined this for the overall scrim, and there's another one for the massing. If I can get to that. So that's a simple mass. So nothing too crazy. I spent a little bit of time and got some line work in there. And even in the alpha channel here, I let the texture of the trace, this is just graphite on trace, I let that be part of what's happening here. You can see the same for this one. But this is the layer that I used. You can't quite see, but some of the haziness from the trace paper did come through. So that's just a bit of added texture. The other thing that I use, and I don't know if that's in here or not, I also included, so again, raw, working, draft, and final, just same files that I've been, folders that I've been recommending that you use. And I don't see it here, but also just had some texture of trace. So I took some trace and I kind of just scrunched it into a ball, nice and folded, and flattened it out and scanned it, because I wanted some additional texture for the overall piece, and so you can kind of get a sense of that. So just a little bit of added visual texture for the overall piece there. And so that was one of the layers. Now I separated this overall composition in terms of the intervention itself and then the overall layout. So in the intervention, I just dealt pretty much straight through from Rhino, and I didn't, get into manipulating the area around. I did that on a separate file. Here, I kind of got into this a little bit more compositionally and started to bring in mixed media and so forth. So this was just a matter of, let's see here for this scrim, and I depends on how you kind of go through it, but in terms of the layer blending, it's a lot of trial and error, you know. I'm going to turn this off, and there's another scrim grab. So layer management is really important in terms of how you're calling these out, so you can kind of get to them. So you can see this is normal at 100% in terms of the layer blending here. This is not, so this is actually divide at 55. So the way I came up with that is I started at dissolve, and then you can just arrow down through these different layer blending, and so I'm going to put it up to 100%, so you can see it's dark there, linear burn, darker color, and I'm just clicking through these until I got something. These were kind of too dark and wasn't quite sure, and I didn't invert the line drawing yet, and so I kind of went down till I found this that kind of lightened things up and gave me a little bit of punch. It's a little too white for this to sort of make sense as a photovoltaic and a screen and so forth, and so that's where I dialed it down. I knew I already had another layer. This is just a duplicate layer here of the scrim, the graphite. So I already knew I had that underneath, and so this is overlaying directly on that. So then I just went in and dialed down the opacity. Whoops, wrong one. Maybe this one, divide. This is just what I chose for this. You may find something else, but it's a way that you can start to really blend imagery into one another. And basically what you're looking at is a series of those. Some of these are normal at 100%. Some of these are overlay. So this is alpha, so the alpha channel of the graphite and of the mass. And so, but that's overlay on this. So if I go to normal, kind of see it's some of that line work kind of beyond there. And then again, I went down till I found something that I liked, and overlay is one that we're able to directly impact what's happening down below, and so that was one that I was satisfied with. And so it'll allow for the images to bleed kind of through these layers, so they really just visually blend into one another, as opposed to a very clear sort of overlay of one layer over the next. And so we're looking at a series of these. This is the all scrim PM photometric. I was using Flamingo to render, and so this is the this is that. So let's see, linear light 25%, and you can kind of see what it looks like. I'll just have it normal, so something like that, and then I just again started to work my way through it. And that was something I was happy with. Or this is kind of oversaturated, so then I just went and dialed this down so it made sense with what was happening overall. I guess it was around 25. And so it's really that one layer over the other. Now, keep in mind when you, I had, let me just turn some of these off. So you can see, several of the layers together here. There are several different outputs here. So one is the pen, which was a print from Rhino. So that's 11 by 17 print at higher resolution. I think I did it at 300 or 600. And then was the photometric, and that came in at a different scale, even though it was the same resolution. And then the scan was a little bit different, even though that was the same resolution at 11 by 17. So that was a digital scan. So you have to, once these come in, and maybe I'll just drag one in. So imagine that this is take it all the way down to something like this. To get, let's say, this to come in, this alpha scrim graphite, what I had to do, I'll go into scrim graphite. So I opened it up in Photoshop, and here it's already open. and it was just the alpha layer that I wanted. So I'll just take this window, drag it down, and I can take this layer and whatever image or file is open below, I can just drag it right in there. And so that's scaled accordingly. But some of these just may be really out of whack, and so you may find yourself having to use the move tool to scale things up or down to get it to match. So this looks like it's actually a little bit smaller. And even because it was a hand drawing, and the way it scanned it was just a little bit off in terms of its rotation, and so I had to scale this up and rotate it just a little bit. Once you click one of these corners, you get these options at the top of Photoshop, and so if you click this is the width, the height for scale with the move tool. I can link these, and then I could dial this up to 102, say, so that'll be both for the length and the height, and this is just going back and forth and tweaking it until this matched up. You can also then either just rotate it here by hand, or I can type something in if you're trying to be really kind of absolute with it, and just tweaking that until it matched up, until everything aligned. So again, there was a lot of going back and forth and tweaking until I got that just right. So you want to be careful of resolution when you're kind of scanning and bringing things in to avoid that, although a little bit of rotation, a little bit of deformation is potentially natural here, just kind of the nature of hand drawing something versus a digital model, which is just more absolute. So that's something that you'll have to think about. And I'll just show you a quick example of some layer blending. Maybe I can close this. And I'll just bring in, I'll just bring in the sky as an example. This is now how I did it, but just so you can see how the layer blending works. The way I do it too is if I put this layer, drag it right into this file, it's going to convert it to this like a smart object, and that you can't work with it as nimbly as you can with the typical image layer. So what I usually do, there may be a shortcut around this and something that I'm not aware of, but I usually just open up the file first in Photoshop. I'll drag the window down here, that tab, and then I'll get the layer and just drag that into whatever file I'm going to use. So you can see this is really tiny, so you can kind of scale it up, but I just want to show you how layer blending will work. So whatever this image is, so I'll hit enter to accept that. If I wanted to blend this into the background somehow, let me just, I don't know, stick it in this corner. There are several options here. So you can see darken, it's starting to affect and kind of darken what's happening down below. So different ways that it's affecting color burn. So it's color burning based off of what the content of that image is, color burning into the layers below. So that's for that, and that's true in terms of, it's affecting the layers below it, and there's just different ways that you can work with. Some of the more common ones you could say is screen is usually a decent one to start with. Overlay, where you can kind of really see how it's potentially going to impact this, and then it's just kind of working around some of these others, whatever you think. Let's see. If you want it really subtle or something that's a little bit more outright. So that's basically how I started to bring these different components together. Now, I could also, if I say I wanted that sky to be as like a texture on that screen, I could also just match it up, and that's partly why I had some of those draft perspective lines there. I can go to edit, and I can go into transform, and I'll just say distort. Maybe I wanted it, I don't know, in this area. I can distort this image. Maybe, I don't know, it's like a projection on this, or some ideas about what I was thinking when I was creating this, something along those lines. And I can just hold, if I'm clicked down in this image, I can hold my Alt key and zoom in and get pretty finite with this. And I have these other perspective lines, so I can just make sure it kind of follows that, and then it should pretty much be in the perspective of the drawing. Again, trial and error, and this is a hand drawing down below, so when I was drafting this, I was twisting my, rotating my lead, and I had a little bit of variation in the line. You know, that'll happen, and that's part of the sort of the hand quality, the manual quality to things. So I don't know, maybe that's fine. I'll enter for that. And so we can just see normal how that looks, and then I don't know, just go through some of these, say what affects those areas, and maybe it's just like an overlay, maybe there's overlay, and then I could kind of dial it down so it's just really subtle, doesn't overtake the overall image, and maybe I back out for that so we can see everything. You know, so it depends on how subtle you want that to be. So that's something to work with each of these. I would also give this a different name so I could go back to it. It's not just layer 2, it would be Sky for Scrim 1 or whatever that might, whatever you think is going to get you to remember what's happening. So there is that. So that's basically, I'm going to just go back to my original here, opening. That's basically how I created this. It was just a series of these overlays with different information, and you can kind of see here some of the aerial photograph textures kind of coming through in this part of the river. Not always, and just kind of bleeds away, and you know, it just gives me a little bit more to work with visually, and then I can really tweak it with the layer blending and what have you. One thing, let's see, I'll close these. I can also just select all these. Well, they won't close all my selection, fortunately. Okay, so here what you're looking at are some layer masks. And there's a variety of reasons on why you might want to do this. Maybe, you know, I'll just, let's see, what is this? Darken 100%. I'll just make this normal. And I'm going to right click on this, disable. So basically what this was for is I had all this white that came through with the print from printing the pen view from Rhino, and I didn't want any of that. And so basically what I did, I forget exactly how I achieved it. I'll turn this off. Oops. So here's a photometric layer, and this, I know if I turn off all these other layers, I know that this has no background to it, so it's just no background, and maybe that's what I was trying to capture, and this didn't include, this mask doesn't include this base, so there's probably another one where it's just the intervention on its own. So if you do it this way, I can use my magic wand tool, make a selection. I know that that's clear, and I can right click and select similar. And so it gets into all the areas that have nothing there, so empty pixels it's selecting. And then I can right click and select the inverse, and then I can go into whatever view, let's just say this view here, and say I want to mask it. So then it took away, can't really see what it took away. Everything that was around there. So just with that, and I just click this mask tool to enable it. So let me I'll just go back here for a sec. Master opacity, change layers, select similar. Okay, I'll go to this one. Just say, for example, I wanted to mask part of this off. just so you can see what it did. Normal. Okay, well I have to select inverse. And so in this case, it's going to provide a mask for everything but what is selected. So I'll select mask, and then I cropped everything out. So now I can kind of work with that. And so I did that so I could just have the intervention on itself, and I forget exactly where that layer is. It might have been one of these others. It's probably solo. I don't know. It was one of these. So, but that's how you can use a mask. Basically what it's doing, you can see here this little vignette, whatever is white is going to include, allow you to see through to the image, and whatever is black is going to exclude. So I could even, if I wanted to, with a brush, and this is part of what I started kind of getting into a little bit, if I had a brush, let me see, these Kyle brushes are usually pretty interesting. This is a plug-in pen brush set that you can download. And let's just try this. So if I were to paint with black using this brush on this, it's going to start to mask it out. And you can see, just go back to layers. And part of this already had things missing, so that's why you're seeing it there. So it's basically a mask for this. But you see it's starting to take away some of that image, and this is kind of going at this pretty crudely, but that's how you can really finesse a mask if you want to. And then if I inverse this, it's going to automatically, the brush color is going to be the white, and so then it'll start to bring that back. At least it should. Just make a selection area so you can see what I mean, and I will fill it with white. So then it brought it back right in that selection. So I'm now manipulating the mask itself, so you can see kind of how that works. I'm not sure why the brush wasn't working. That should work to bring that back. Anyway, there. Maybe the brush just wasn't working. So I'm kind of brushing now with the image mask and allowing some things to kind of come through and not. And if you had a pressure-sensitive screen or a Wacom or something, that pressure sensitivity would be reflected as you kind of went through. I'm just using my mouse right here, but I do use a Wacom sometimes for this. So, you know, however, and it's not doing anything here because there was nothing there to begin with in terms of the image. It's hard to see the little white, there was nothing there. So you can just kind of brush with this, and this is kind of, again, crude, because there's no pressure sensitivity or anything. That's why some of these other brushes are sort of interesting to work with, like, I don't know, I've been messing around with splatter brush. Where is it? There. You can see it kind of coming through, so just really lightly I can bring some of that texture back if I wanted to. Splatter brush, this is another interesting one. So it's like splatters of paint. Just the size, I'm holding my Alt key down and right clicking. It's a shortcut to size your brush. And the same way I could flip this back and start to take a little bit away. Now, pressure sensitivity goes a long way there, but you can kind of get a sense of how that masks. So all I'm doing here is manipulating this mask itself. And so I'm either painting with white or black to allow this more or less of this image to show through. That's basically it. I'm going to go back to history. Oh, yeah, history. Okay. So, you know, with the alpha channels that I used for the graphite pencil, I actually tinted one of them, so the scrim, I believe, let's see, that would be the mass. So here, alpha mass sepia, I actually changed the color of it. Here's one that is same graphite, 100% through, and I think I probably had that off. Oh, this is the scrim for the mass, right? So I changed the color of this, and I did that, I think, back here. So there's one that's a sepia color. So I loaded the selection. So instead of filling with black like we've been doing before, I'll just show you another selection here, and I grabbed some color. I forget what color I used, because I kind of like that sepia tone. Let's just say it's, I don't know, this blue color, a little darker. Okay. So that's there, so I can create a new layer, then I could go into selection and load the selection, the alpha, okay. Oops. There it is, it was turned off. So instead of, oh, it didn't carry through, unfortunately. So I'd have to find that color and make sure it would transfer over to this. But I could fill it. Let's just choose another color. So I choose, I don't know, maybe it's one of these brown, like this brown. Let's just do red. And then instead of black, I'll fill it with that red. And I want the, oh, I know why it didn't work. It's not giving me colors here. Should be able to fill it with whatever color I want to. But for some reason, oh, there comes that foreground color. There's the blue. That was maybe just because I didn't have the other layers open or something. It wasn't letting me fill it, but that's the original blue that I had selected. So I'm in layer 2. I should be able to go into fill. Foreground color. It's kind of hard to tell if you select, but it's that blue color that's in there now. So then if I take that layer and bring it into whichever file, instead of the sepia color, I would have this bluish color. So that's how I changed the color. It was the same graphite drawing, but I just changed the color based off of that. So a few things to consider. Again, this is kind of getting pretty nuanced with how this was approached. Let's see. But there are things to consider. Photoshop is a very robust program. So that's how I compiled this, so a series of those layers coming together. And I wanted to do that separately because I know, I didn't want the layers to get kind of crazy. Just so many layers for not only the overall layout, but the intervention itself. It just would have multiplied exponentially. And what I did here, I outputted the image, and then I brought it into the overall layout here. And so we go into some of the layers here. Here I have intervention all. So that's basically, I just brought that in, and it's floating in this overall space here. Again, these lines I created separately from the lines on the scrim, so one was for layout, so I have this kind of framing going on, and then one is for, in terms of the graphite drawing, one is for the intervention. And even with this, then, I started to work with, you can see there's a mask here, and that's how I started to kind of work my way through breaking down some of this context here based off of some of these lines, where I wanted kind of like these banners of information to kind of fly around. These are articles about the area, about Milwaukee, that are relative, that I thought, to the project, similar to this. In addition to the aerial photograph that you can see here as part of the background, and then some of the panoramic. So really the way I did this, based off of some of these compositional lines here, just created a series of masks. So like, for example, the aerial photograph, if I can find your aerial photograph, here it is. And if I right click, I can disable the mask. And right now it's overlay. Let's just say normal, 100%. So this just fills up the whole area here, but once I mask it out, enable layer, it's blocked out in certain areas. So that's just me painting with either black to block out or white to kind of create these openings, so let the sky kind of bleed through and so forth, and to let the panoramic read in certain areas and the aerial to read in other areas. So that's how I started to kind of work through this. I had a couple layers here in terms of the aerial one. I think I wanted to punch it up. Let me just go back. So one of them I had as overlay, the other one is linear light. So I was just getting kind of different effects for these, and I block them out differently in terms of the masking, to just get a different kind of deeper read of the overall aerial as a texture. And I did something similar for the panoramic. So the panoramic crews, I have these in a folder. So if you just, you can create a folder here and just drag other image layers into there. It starts to be important here. Here are all the layers for that. You can also color these. Just right click and you can give it a particular color if that helps you kind of visualize different groups, things that belong together. I just started to do that recently in my own work. But these are all blocked out as well. So if I disable, you can see how these were blocked out to create certain effects. So these panoramics, I'm going to go back to open. The sky was something, and this doesn't have Entourage, other than, for kind of some context in terms of proportion. It's a very abstract piece. I want you guys to think about Entourage. So you should think about human figures and so forth, vegetation. Again, this is very preliminary schematic stuff here, very gestural, very speculative. But I did include something akin to a sky. Again, it kind of goes down and underneath and kind of relates to the panoramic, but also this image, so it's pretty abstract, and it's that same sky that I was working with earlier. The only thing is, so it's different at 20%. Again, and it's masked out, and you can see here where I started to use a little bit of that splatter just to kind of let it bleed, just to give it a little bit more texture, not to let it be so absolute. And then so it's different, so okay, normal. So that's what it looked like in its regular state, and so I was just worked through layer blending until I got to something that I thought was good, and I just didn't want to, it's a beautiful looking sky, but I just wanted something that was lighter, a little bit airier, and I could have found another sky image that was just more like that, but once I got to difference, it started to work for me. Not this saturated, so I just dialed it down. I dialed the opacity down to whatever it was, like 20 or 25, whatever that was. So it's just enough to give me some ideas about clouds, just enough to say it's a sky, but these are kind of afloat a little bit, and that's just something I worked with for this piece. So you might find something else that's more appropriate. These banners, these are also in their own folder here, so I can turn them on or off. And I worked with these in a similar way that I was working with the panoramas. And so here, normal 45, and then I just started, really this is just masking. So I created a mask for it, kind of clipped it out, so I could disable the mask. So you can see that's basically aligned it up with this perspective lines. And then I just made the selection kind of overall where I wanted it to be and not to be. And then started to use different tools like the brush tool, different brushes and so forth to paint with white or black, to take out or to add some of this texture. So enough where I can read it, not enough to where it overpowers the overall composition. I wanted the eye to really be around this intervention piece. And so that's essentially how that was created. It's normal, 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 and I think the overall folder then is where I applied the layer blending, and then I did the opacities individually because they were just different depending on where they were. So this was down here very different, but the overall effect was vivid light, and that's just what I thought was appropriate for that. I'm just kind of working through, rolling through. Yeah, so you can see different ways it might affect. So this is the one that I thought was pretty good. It gave, again, another texture. Again, this was just about ideas, and so that's essentially how I created that. In terms of Entourage, I'll move to this piece. This is a little bit more of a traditional, I guess, rendering, you could say. The way I did it for this is I had, these are just images of trees that I had found, and I think I just made some selections, and I didn't create an alpha channel for this, but you definitely could. And if you do a search for Entourage or for PNG trees, you can find those, so everything around would just be clear, and you'll just have the tree information. And then that with the, I think the spot healing tool here, where you can take, let's see, so you basically take a sample of part of an image, and then you can kind of work with it, and then it's almost like content aware, where the it'll paint and but it kind of adjust relative to what it is that you're working with. So I was working with that. If I can see, find where are the trees. And this layer management is not very good. There's kind of stuff all over the place. But where is trees? Here they are. And I blurred some of them here. There's a layer on here. I converted this to a smart filter. For smart filters. I did that here so I can kind of go back to the Gaussian blur and dial it up or down depending on, so I wanted to be able to edit the filter, which you can only do if you convert it for smart filters, or convert for smart filters there. So that's a layer that is over the same layer. Let's see, where is this tree? Oh, it's that tree right there. Yeah, so here this tree is here. It's normal, 55%, so nothing too crazy there. And it's not perfect of a tree. It's enough. It's pretty small back in this perspective, so it doesn't. You don't see all these little flaws or anything. But then to help with that, I overlaid this little blur, so it just kind of softens it a little bit. And I could probably worked a little bit more with layer blending and done something a little bit more, but that was enough for me. And again, the smart filter allows me then to I could just double click on this and get back and change that blur, either really blur it out or a little bit less blur, what have you. So that's how I created the tree. And then I was going to show that other tool. Let's see. So if I was, let's just get on this layer, and then I wanted to use that healing brush tool. I should be able to select like a sample layer, so hold my Alt key, it's kind of like the stamp tool. And then I should be able to brush around. Again, it's not perfect, but it's something kind of similar to it, and that's essentially how I created these additional kind of bushes. So there was some information there, but I just kind of started kind of painting in that way, and then just really dialed it down in terms of the opacity, and then you can't really, you know, it's enough to say that there's vegetation there. So that's how I did that. The other part is the just entourage. So these were different tool. There's a person up there. These were silhouettes. So again, if you do a search for architectural entourage silhouettes, you can find a bunch of stuff, Illustrator files or PNG files, where then you can just kind of clip these out, whether in Photoshop or otherwise, and then bring them in to work. So I had a person kind of sitting here, and let me see if I can get to the others. I had all these in a folder. I didn't end up using them all. So here's, you know, I decided to get rid of this couple. I think because I wanted to open this space up. This is a little kind of a linear kind of pavilion park project in Milwaukee that I was working on. But one thing, and I guess I'll show you with this one, that you want to make sure, and I don't know if I actually used a guide for this or not, but you know, the horizon is consistent for pretty much everybody, especially when you're rendering like this. And so this is actually a little bit off. So the heads, all the heads should align. So eye level, more or less, that's pretty close. This guy would not be at eye level because he's sitting down, so he's a little bit below, but you know, large or small, that's how they would line up. And so this is another silhouette that I didn't end up using, that was on a different layer. It's on that layer, yep. So I'll just turn it all the way up so you can see it black there, and I'll just make him bigger. And the resolution isn't great there. So got to be careful with resolution. In any case, in this case I wanted to use wet silhouettes, so I just went ahead into image and I inverted that person. And then I want to figure out where they are in space. So I don't know, let's put this guy somewhere. Maybe he's way back there, just kind of looking at this great pavilion. So then I'll scale it down so his head lines up with that line. That puts him into the space. Enter to accept that, and then dial down the opacity till it just made sense. And so I guess with all of this I got a little bit busy. I guess I was fine with the people way in the background and this person sitting. Again, trial and error, it's up to you. And so, I don't know, I guess that kind of worked. So you just kind of visually make sure it's not too light, but not overpowering, and so maybe 15% makes some sense. And then that's enough. And there you go. So again, I didn't use, you know, all of those, but that's how you put people kind of into the context. And you have to know where the horizon pretty much is. And so in one of the tutorials, I believe I was talking about the horizon line, where you kind of draw a line like around 6 foot. And so you kind of have that, or just know where it is in the perspective view. So you can have your Rhino file open and see that line, and then match it up with something that you kind of know is here, and maybe just bring down a guide so you know where that is. And then you could start placing people in the proper context. Too much. Oops. Let's go back there. Yeah, I guess I went with that. Maybe it's a little vacant now. I don't know. Anyway, that's a few steps. You can even see here in the background, very lightly, I threw part of an elevation drawing of this pavilion, even with some notes, just again, more texture, about speculation. It's a little bit more about demonstrating or articulating a kind of part of the process here in terms of spatial composition. So I included that there. Again, I matched it up with the perspective of this context building, this mass right there, and got it close enough. And then these notes are just in the air, flying there, and that was fine. I probably would do a little bit more of that if I could. This one was sort of enough, and I think I actually ended up cropping it about here. I got a little too wide of an overall view, so I think I cropped it a little bit. In any case, those are a few things to consider as you're kind of moving through and creating some of your hybrid drawings. I don't expect them all to be this intense. This did take a little bit of time, but they should be akin to this. They should show not only your digital work, but your manual work. So those lines brought together, and you have the tools to bring those using alpha channels and so forth, some suggestion of sky, and perhaps just something other about ideas, maybe some context imagery. Just work with it. Think of each as an important piece, and start to develop a workflow for you. This is just how I kind of work through it, but for you to develop a workflow to create something and bring various components together, bring your thinking together visually to present to others. And this is something, potentially, as a beginning piece, a client might appreciate. Depends on the client, but these are the things to consider, especially for design communication and architectural design. Okay, that'll do it. Thanks, guys.